How you doing, gamers? This is John with Gamester81.com. This episode, I'm going to review the Wonder Swan Color by Bandai. This came out in December of 2000. Before I dive into this review, I just want to say one thing. I did review this system a little bit earlier. A lot of you guys may have noticed. But the audio didn't turn out as well as I would have liked. A lot of you guys comment on the audio quality. So I decided to take time to redo this video, do the system justice, because I think this is a really cool handheld, and I definitely want to show respect to it. So, once again, appreciate you guys' feedback. Thanks for sticking with me on that, all right? So back to this review. The system came out in 2000, as I mentioned before, but this is the second handheld in the line of Wonder Swan. So first one being the Wonder Swan, original Wonder Swan, came out in 1999. This one came out in 2000, and then the Swan Crystal came out, I believe, around 2001. There's three handhelds. The whole line lasted from 1999 to 2003. It actually was created by Bandai, or released by Bandai, but it was a joint venture between Bandai and a company called Kodo. This system was only released in Japan, it was not released outside Japan. Kodo was actually the president and founder of Kodo, is a guy, you may recognize the name if you're familiar with Nintendo. His name is Gunpei Yokoi. Gunpei actually worked with Nintendo for many years, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. He helped create the Game & Watch line by Nintendo, which was a huge success. Eventually, he also created Nintendo Game Boy, which I'm assuming most of us gamers are familiar with the Game Boy. It came out in the late 80s, did very well for Nintendo. In fact, it really established their dominance in the handheld market. Later on in the mid-90s, he released the Virtual Boy and developed the Virtual Boy. There was a lot of hype for the Virtual Boy. Unfortunately, it didn't do very well. In fact, it's considered a flop. It didn't sell outside of Japan and North America. In fact, in North America alone, there's only a dozen or so games released for it. Personally, I love the Virtual Boy, but looking back on it, it didn't do very well. I think it was really ahead of its time. But because it didn't do very well and it didn't meet Nintendo's expectations, so to speak, they kind of threw Gunpei Yokoi under the bus. They let him go. He said, okay, I'll create my own company. He created Kodo, teamed with Bandai, and he designed the Wonder Swan. It's kind of a unique design. This isn't the very first 16-bit handheld, although it is 16-bit. Actually, the Neo Geo Pocket hit the market in 1998, a year before the Wonder Swan did. Bandai had seen that in Japan, Nintendo had a dominance still in the handheld market. At the time, in the late 90s, Nintendo had the Nintendo Game Boy Color line, hugely successful. And eventually, Nintendo would release the Game Boy Advance that came out in 2001, obviously very successful as well. And unfortunately, Wonder Swan is short-lived. They did have some success, though, in capturing some of the market share. They released 8%. They actually captured 8% of the handheld market share. Part of that was because of the pricing. This thing retailed for 6,800 yen, which is equivalent to about $59 US back in the early 2000s, which I think is a pretty reasonable price. 193 games were released for it. A lot of them were first-party games. There's only a couple third-party developers and publishers for the Bandai Wonder Swan, one being Square, which is, if you see in front of me, I have this Final Fantasy bundle. They had two bundles. They had this one, they have a Final Fantasy 2 bundle. This is basically a port from the Famicom, the original Famicom Final Fantasy, or the NES Final Fantasy, and same with the Final Fantasy 2. So that obviously helped push sales. They also teamed up with Capcom. So two huge names. Some of the games Capcom released for example, was a Rockman series, Rockman game, which is what a lot of us know as Mega Man. Tetris was released for the Wonder Swan. Many of us know Tetris, as well as Space Invaders. So there's a few well-known titles, but most of the 193 games are in Japanese, and therefore are difficult for any really collectors to really understand, especially when it comes to role-playing games like Final Fantasy in Japanese. Unless you speak Japanese fluently, it's hard to read. One downfall about the Wonder Swan, a couple of them actually, it's not backlit compatible. This was no big deal really back in the early 2000s, late 90s, because if you think about it, Game Boy Color wasn't backlit, and the first Game Boy Advance wasn't backlit, and neither was the Neo Geo Pocket or the Neo Geo Pocket Color. So not a huge deal, but looking back on it now, it's definitely a pain to have to bring a light to it and play with a light. But one of the reasons they did that is because they want to conserve battery power. So this thing runs off a 1 AA battery, and with gameplay, it lasts 20 hours. So that's pretty efficient gameplay. And speaking of colors, it does display 4,056 different colors to choose from. And so, and one cool thing about the Wonder Swan Color, it will play all Wonder Swan games. But however, the Wonder Swan will not necessarily play all Wonder Swan Colors games, if that makes sense. Now, if you're wondering what the difference between the Swan Crystal and the Wonder Swan Color are, basically the screen and the resolution. Another downfall, I mentioned there's two. Another downfall about the Wonder Swan Color is that it had a lot of ghosting, meaning if there's a lot of movement in the screen, the brights tend to kind of blur together. The Swan Crystal addressed that, and they fixed that. As far as memory goes, it doesn't have too much in today's standards, obviously. It has 512 kilobytes of RAM storage, so Not too much in today's standards, but not too bad considering when the time came out. So without any further ado, let's take a closer look at the box and what came included with this particular bundle. I'll show you some gameplay. Thanks for watching, guys. Let's take a closer look at the package design itself. Pretty plain, but I actually like it. It's kind of very simple, but I'm kind of one for simple when comes to things like this. So you got the Fun Fancy logo here, open in the back. Here's some screenshots, bullet points in Japanese, of course. Open this up. A nice screen here, like good, nice display of the system and the box of the game itself. Some great artwork. Let's open this up. The box itself is very similar in box size as you would see a Japanese Game Boy game. Some more artwork. Take a closer look at the system itself. Here's the system. You notice that the action buttons are B and A, backwards, just like Nintendo. My understanding from what I've heard is because the reason it's BA, not AB, because Japanese read right to left. Therefore it's AB, okay? You also have your directional pads here. They're also individually numbered here. You got X1, X2, X4, X3, and the Y numbers, same thing. The reason there's two is because not only can you play it horizontally like this, you can also play it vertically on some games, which is really cool. There's a power button here. You have your sound button here. You can push up to make it louder, push down to make it softer as well. This is the speaker where it comes out of, okay? Also, you have your wheel here for contrast. You have this connection cord here, and the reason there's a connector cord adapter here is because there's several accessories that came out for the Wonder Swan line of systems. A couple of them I'll name. The Wonder Wave, which actually connected to the Pocket Station, which is by Sony, came out in Japan. It was a very small handheld device. Also, a Wonder Witch, which is connected to a PC. You can actually develop games for it, which is pretty cool. Also, there's a connection cord to play multiplayer to another, hook it up to another Wonder Swan. This is where the cartridge actually slide into. As I mentioned earlier in this video, it does only run off of one battery, which is a plus. It runs off of one AA battery. And there's a lock here. You can lock it. You can unlock it. This thing comes out like so. It lasts 20 hours of gameplay. Now compare this to other handhelds in the market. Both the Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, and the Neo Geo Pocket ran off of several batteries. I'll show you that in a second. So speaking of those handhelds, let's compare this with those. Right now, from just lifting it, Game Boy Color is actually significantly heavier than the Wonder Swan Color. Horizontally, systems are almost identical as far as height go. Game Boy Color might be a little bit taller. Width-wise, Game Boy Color is a little bit thicker. And let's see here, screen-wise, I'd say the Wonder Swan Color has a wider screen and about as tall as well, so a bigger, wider screen than the Game Boy Color. Compared to the Game Boy Advance, the screen on the Game Boy Advance is a little bit bigger. Buttons are obviously bigger on the Game Boy Advance. The system itself, Game Boy Advance, is heavier as well than the Color, but also runs off of two batteries in one, and the Color actually runs off of multiple batteries as well, two batteries as well. So, as I mentioned before, it takes a little more power to power the competitors here, but overall the Game Boy Advance has a little bigger screen than the Wonder Swan Color. Finally, compare it to the Neo Geo Pocket Color. Pocket Color is significantly wider, about the same width and height, but the Neo Geo Pocket Color has a little wider screen, taller screen, and not as wide. Now I'm going to compare the game carts themselves. Game carts slides in the back here. One thing I don't really care for about the Wonder Swan game carts are that the ROMs can kind of be exposed here. Compared it to a Game Boy Color cart, you can see a little wider, about the same height. Compare it to a Game Boy Advance. Similar in size, Game Boy Advance carts are a little bit smaller than the Wonder Swan Color. And finally comparing it to a Neo Geo Pocket. Neo Geo Pocket games are a little taller and shorter. They're not as wide. Do my best anyway. The glare, it's really hard. I have a light right behind me trying to do my best to shine the best light, but I have to get the right angle to show you, otherwise it's not going to show up very well. So I'll do my best here. Before I do that, if you push start and power at the same time, you go to a menu screen. Basically asks you for the name. Right now it's at Wonder Swan Color is the name. You can change that. Birth date. So it goes year, month, day. Asks for the sex. Yes, please. Blood type. Kind of unusual to ask you for blood type. I guess that's pretty common in Japan to ask you for blood type. Kind of strange. And okay. So let's load up the game. Square off. You can see how loud it is. So let's turn down. That's mute. That's mute. There's no bar, volume bar, which is interesting. Love the Final Fantasy music. It's just classic. This is the contrast on here. Let's see if I can do the contrast. That's dark, light. So yeah, you can't really see much, and I apologize. Let me see if I can adjust the contrast. It'd be a little bit better, but yeah, it's definitely not ideal. And there's no really easy capture device to capture it, unfortunately, for you guys. But you guys can definitely get the idea. That's the loudest it gets. So I guess it could get kind of louder. Another thing, let's see if there's it's another thing interesting I just noticed. There is no headset place, so there's nowhere to put a headset, which is, that can't be right. I don't see any place to put a headset. Wow. So no headphones, unfortunately, not that I can see. Maybe it goes to the attachment here, I don't know, but that's weird. You'd think there'd be a jack for the headphone jack. Last thing I want to mention, guys, is because it's the Final Fantasy version, this is white. A lot of the Wonder Swans colors were different colors. There's like a blue, kind of transparent blue, for example. The white models were the Final Fantasy models. You can also see top here, there's like a Final Fantasy character there, a little artwork from Final Fantasy. So this is kind of represents the Final Fantasy edition, so to speak. That concludes my review over the Bandai Wonder Swan color. Let me know what you guys think about the system. If you guys own one, I'd be curious what your guys' opinions on the system is. What are your favorite of these four in front of me? What are your favorite? What are some games you like? So please leave a comment below. Thanks for subscribing, guys. Thanks for thumbing up. We'll see you guys soon. Take care.